My name is Khalil.
An overview
Admittedly.
So to start Journal Club, we're going to have Miss Freedom Salas from Pennsylvania State University presenting Incidence, Severity, Aetiologia, and Prevention of Sports Injuries. So if Freedom, can you share your screen, please?
Okay. Can you guys see my screen? Can you guys see my screen?
Yeah, we could see you, but not your screen.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to share screen.
There should be the share screen button on the bottom.
The green button in the front.
Oh, okay. So my name is Freedom Salas. I'm from Penn State University. Class of 2023. I'm majoring in Aetiology, and here are my clubs. Sorry, I don't know why it's taking so long. So the title of the study that I was doing was Incidence, Severity, Etiology, and Prevention of Sports Injuries. Here are the authors, and it's presented by myself. I apologize. I'm not sure why it's loading like this. Okay. So the objective of the research was so they can see the frequency in the sports injuries in the Netherlands, and just to see like and compare it to other accidents and injuries that happen and how frequent it is, not only for an athlete but just in general, compared to other accidents. Okay. So what incidence means is the occurrence, the rate, or the frequency of a disease, crime, or something undesirable. So it's just like the frequency basically. So 1.4 injuries per 1,000 hours are medically treated. And one of the methods that they used in this study was comparing the numbers of the sports injuries to other accidents, so they can like show that how much more frequent it is. And I'll show you guys an example of that later in the presentation. And in this study, out of 2.7 million sports injuries, 1.7 were medically treated. The method that they chose to do for this study was a survey, and they analyzed the populations of athletes in the Netherlands and school children. They did different types of surveys, and I listed them here. They did a survey of home and leisure time accidents, the survey of morbidity over 4 years, and it's an ongoing survey, and a telephone survey. And as I said before, they compared it to other accidents to show the frequency. Okay, here is just the chart. Here on the left, the first image is showing like different situations of how you can get an injury, a sports injury. For example, what you see on the right, what's pointing to the middle is the equipment. So your risk of getting an injury with things such as shin guards, braces, and protective gear is lower than somebody such as Rugby who doesn't wear any gear and are more like physical. And we take a lot of things into effect, such as like the type of the sport, the physical factors, as the weather, and the teammates, the coach, the competition. And here on the right is just explaining basically the same thing, the flexibility, how often you go to practice, your age, your sex, and just taking everything into consideration, looking at the injuries and how it can become more frequent or less frequent. And here are the results. 21% of all accidents took place at sports and recreational locations. And this was talking about the surveys with the home time leisures. The person that did that study came to this result. And the second result was the person that did the telephone surveys. They got from the morbidity survey in the Netherlands, an average of 2.4% has been calculated over 4 years. And finally, this was the comparison that I was talking about previously. Overall, from a total of 32,276 accidents, 28.6 were from sports, 4.9% were from leisure time games, 0.7% to occupational activities, and 9.1% to road accidents. And they got this information from hospitals and places that they were working with over the 6 months that can provide them the information and data that they were seeking for. And here is a chart showing what, like, the level of the injury and how it was treated. So you see it was self-treated, and a lot of them were medically treated. 1.7 million out of the 2.7 million were medically treated, so that's a significant amount. And this is a chart showing. The point of the study was to see how frequent sports injury happens and show that it happens a lot in countries. Like, a lot of people may see as car accidents and small things, but they don't actually just look at just sports, which is a very common way to get injured. You may have fun and it may be competitive, however, you can still get injured, and this doing that. And they wanted to show how it was classified when they were treated, if you were self-treated, medically treated, if you had to go to a chiropractor or a physicist. And it also concentrated on a really broad group, which were the students, and a really concentrated group. And it's my reference. And that's all.
Thank you for that. Does anyone have any questions? If there are no questions, we can go on to the next journal club presentation by Lilianna Tasovac from Binghamton University, and she's going to be presenting on the severity of sports injuries. So Lilianna, if you could share your screen, please.
Thank you, Megan, for that introduction. Are you guys able to see my screen?
Yes.
Freedom, you have to unshare your screen.
Now we can see your screen, Lilianna.
Great. All right. So my name is Lilianna Tasovac, and I'm currently going into my sophomore year at the State University of Binghamton in New York, and I'm pursuing a bachelor's degree in biology. So today I will be presenting The Severity of Sports Injuries by William Van Mechelen. So the overall objective of this study was to identify both the severity and incidence of sports injuries to necessarily assess the true extent of the sports injury problem both worldwide and in certain communities. So a little background before I begin. The most common sports-related injury is typically either a sprain or a contusion near lower extremities, such as the ankle. And these typically occur in most conventional sports like soccer, football, rugby, any type of conventional sport that's usually played in high school or at the professional level. But however, depending on the sport, the most common injuries may be slightly different or dramatically different. For example, in some non-conventional sports that they mentioned, such as like horseback riding or paragliding, fractures or injuries in that relative area are a little bit more common than a minor sprain or a contusion. So when looking at the severity of an injury, the higher the severity the injury holds on the athlete, the priority to try and prevent these injuries further increases drastically. So for example, if an athlete suffers an ACL tear or a broken bone, researchers take those injuries and put them at a higher priority than something like a laceration or a minor ankle sprain to hopefully prevent these in the future instead. So the way this article was written was not the typical case study we usually look at. It didn't really have like a methodology or a results section. The author mainly talked about the criteria they have kind of developed to start an injury registration or like an injury surveillance system. So ultimately, the approach to this study was to determine the incidence and severity of sports injuries, and they analyzed the six different criteria areas. So beginning of this article, the first area of criteria was the nature of sports injuries. So in this section, they talked about how the nature of a given injury determines whether a player requires medical assistance. So usually injuries are put into two different categories, which we'll see later on. It's either the player requires medical assistance and then they can go back into play, or they don't have any long-term effects, or they essentially lose time from play or practice or any type of gameplay from that injury. So depending on if the injury is new or recurrent, it is extremely important to note who recorded this injury and where the injury was examined, because there's a wide difference between an athletic trainer examining and recording an injury versus a coach, because obviously the athletic trainer is more experienced in injuries. So having this knowledge of the nature of most injuries allows researchers to determine which sports require injury intervention. So basically, in a community, if a few different sports are being played, if researchers have that knowledge that football reports more injuries than, say, soccer or baseball, they'll look towards football first, have that whole intervention level, and prioritize that sport. So next we have the second criteria point, which is the duration and nature of the treatment. So used to precisely determine the severity of injuries for comparison purposes, we need to look at how the injury is treated and how long the athlete needs to be under this certain treatment, meaning just if they had obviously a surgery or a cast, or after that, we also need to look at the physical therapy or the pre-therapy that was involved. So treatment methods allow researchers to compare the effectiveness across similar results. So using this criteria method, if one treatment works for a certain injury, they can use that same thing and compare it with another injury, which the kind of it's like a backhand. So if this method worked, then they can say that it worked and it's foolproof, so we can use it for the next injury. And with this information, the severity and nature of an injury coincides directly, because the longer the duration of treatment, the more severe. So obviously, as I said before, an ACL injury is almost completely different than a minor sprain. And with that athlete, say they tear their ACL, there's gonna be a lot of physical therapy and a lot longer time lost from that injury. So the third criteria point that the authors discussed was the sport time lost. So time lost due to an injury is the most precise consequence of injuries. So basically, if an athlete loses time from a game, practice, or any type of even like work, or they're just out of daily activities, we can highlight the severity of an injury. So although only around 40 to 50% of sports injuries result in that time loss, the severity of an injury can be determined based on how long a player was out of play. So if a player was out for like 1 to 3 days, we can classify that as like a mild injury. But if they miss longer than a week or 2 weeks, we can classify that as a severe injury. So our fourth criteria point that they highlighted was working time lost. So this is kind of not related to gameplay or practice, but this set of criteria involves the financial cost of sports injuries in societies while comparing it to other injury risk jobs. So they kind of look at sports injuries versus injuries that can happen in someone's occupation. And this is mainly important for the involvement of potential separate insurance platforms. So researchers were looking at a way to separate the financial costs of sports injuries versus working injuries. So to move on to our fifth point, this section was extremely important because they highlighted permanent damage, which obviously correlates to having an extremely severe injury. So depending on the severity of an injury, permanent damage can occur within an individual. And this potential permanent damage can also lead to some athletes into changing their sport, which meaning that, say they suffer an extreme injury in football, their parents or themselves, they might not want to go back to that sport after they recover because they're either scared or they don't have that same competitive nature, or they don't have that same level of play, so they might change their sport into something easier or less that has less player-to-player contact. And it can also reduce their work capacity, both short and long term. So say a player is recovering from an injury, they may be out of work and sports for 4 to 5 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, any time frame, which obviously reduces that work capacity. And in this case, injuries that have a history of permanent damage should have prioritize preventative measures. So if there's a long history of athletes suffering permanent damage based on one certain injury, which I feel like we could see that mostly in concussions, where we see like traumatic brain injuries and long-term damage. researchers can prioritize those injuries and those sports with higher incidence rates of concussions, so they can try and prevent that for the later athletes. So the last criteria point that they considered was the cost of sports injuries. This one was extremely interesting because it looked at sports injuries at a different standpoint instead of just how it's affecting the athlete. So the cost of sports injuries can be separated into direct costs, which was kind of just like the medical treatment. So either the surgery, hospital time, physical therapy, anything like that. And then indirect costs, which would be expenses for loss of productivity. So if an athlete's bedridden for 4 weeks, there's also expenses into that, of course. So a cost analysis is ultimately essential because it allows communities to determine which sports are the most expensive. So, for example, if football has that high incidence rate of costly injuries, researchers can then prioritize that sport before others to prevent those injuries later on. Because if that sport is costing a community or obviously the nation a lot more money than a sport such as baseball or soccer, we need to prioritize that first to have an intervention method and a preventative method so we can lower the economic costs of that sport. So ultimately, when looking at the cost of sports injuries, we can determine which sports need the quickest and most efficient intervention. So to conclude, when looking at the severity and incidence rates of sports injuries within a population, the sports injury problem overall can be addressed. And it was then determined that although the 6 criteria points in determining the severity are extremely closely related, it's important to assess every single point. So we ultimately need to find out when and who recorded. We also need to see how long that duration was of the treatment, how much it cost, how long the player was out of play, if they were out of play. And overall, the researchers developed a strong setup to identify, assess, and hopefully prevent severe injuries from occurring in the future. And that's it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Liliana, for the presentation. Does anyone have any questions? Dr. Lopez, do you have anything to add?
No, thank you so much, Lily. That was a great talk, as well as Freedom. It's unique. I don't know if you know how important Dr. Van Mechelen is in regards to what we've been doing. The whole sports injury prevention cascade has been dependent on some of his early work, and based upon it, setting up the structure from early 90s until now, even dictating even the handbook of sports injury prevention by Dr. Embekson and Dr. Barr, Rold Barr, that is. It's a very unique aspect of sports medicine that has given us an insight of where injuries go, the direction of how we should be taking care of them. And overall, like I said, the incidence really gives you a strong idea of how frequent and how prevalent the injury is among a population. But again, why don't we all turn our cameras on, we'll take a quick picture before we leave.
I think we're all set. Oh, wait, hold on. I'll take one more. Ready? Okay.
Great. Again, like I said, it was a very good point to bring up the earlier topics of the non-contact injuries, and I think bringing into ACL the overall understanding of that. Secondly, I think the unique thing is, even though Dr. Bjerregaard as well as Dr. Ma come from 2 different disciplines within sport, the unique thing is that both of them emphasize the psychological hurdle of sports psychology, and that is for athletes to be prepared in returning to sport. Again, I think we had a great talk this evening, And I think we summarized nicely with the way Lilianna brought in the topics in regards to the way Dr. Van Mechelen envisions the different analyses necessary to look at severity overall. When you look at severity, very different than burden. Severity overall, they're looking at the amount of days absence, the amount of impact that an injury takes upon an athlete, a team, a community, work, as well as livelihood. And these are all factors that need to be considered when you're looking at these things. And I guess this is where the direction of our cost analyses now. Again, Dr. Bjerregaard, do you have any final comments?
No, I also enjoyed the last two presentations, and I think his work is very, very important in all the injury prevention as well. So I really highlight also that I think the first presentation, I know some of the work you have done is the first step in injury prevention, like epidemiology studies, finding out how many injuries there are. Then we can come up with a prevention program. Then we can go in and see what can reduce the injuries, and then we can recycle the circle again. So very important to highlight his work, and he was also highlighted as the keynote speaker at the last Olympic IOC conference. So very important person. So thank you so much again for inviting me and be a part of it. And hopefully see you soon, maybe in Monaco in February, and all your others as well.
No, tusen tack och jag gläder mig till att se dig personligen snart. Unskilled. It's been a bit a little rusty in my Norwegian, obviously, everyone. That's but I was forced to learn it at the Lutheran church. But anyway, I don't know if everyone knows history. That's why the Danish love putting the map and telling everyone where they're at, to let everyone know where the Scandinavian peninsula is. And that the Danish owned Norway, and then the Swedish owned Norway, and then the Swedish owned Denmark. Am I correct? That was the order of history?
Yes, I think you can find the history if you go to Netflix and watch the Netflix series Vikings.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you again, Andreas. All right. And you have a good evening.
Yeah, you too. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you all for attending tonight.